Chapter 12, and for the rest of the semester, we're in Europe. Now, folk, counting today, there are only 5 more lectures. The semester's about over. All right, anyway. Medieval Europe. Making of Europe. Your book opens up with a vignette about Charlemagne. That name means Charles the Great. He was the greatest ruler that Europe had, as far as the biggest empire that Europe had, during the more than, 1,200 year period that's in between the fall of the Roman Empire and Napoleon. Only in the 1800s did Napoleon finally build up a bigger empire than his. His empire included France, what is today France, most of Germany, Switzerland, and northern Italy. Not all of Italy, but the northern part. So his empire is fairly large. And on Christmas Day in the year 800, the Pope crowned him Roman Emperor.
Did you about Charlemagne?
Charlemagne, yes. We do not know if he wanted the title. He was down in Rome anyway to help the Pope. And then it's supposed to, during a prayer ceremony, the Pope sneaked up on him and placed a crown on his head and said, "Arise, O Emperor of the Romans." He was the first non-Roman to be crowned Roman Empire in the West. There were still some Romans around, but none of them had the title of Emperor since 476. This was the beginning, we think. Some people believe this was the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire, which lasted 1,000 years. The title of Holy Roman Emperor was finally abolished by Napoleon, same man, in the year 1802. But for 1,000 years, Europe had a Holy Roman Empire. The whole purpose of it, folks, was the church's attempt, and again, I hope that none of them think I'm knocking the church. It was a church's attempt to revive the ancient Roman Empire, but try as they might, the Roman Empire would not revive. All right. I've turned the page, looked at page 328. Early Middle Ages. Europe coming out, Europe taking shape in the early Middle Ages. When we left Europe, several weeks ago, several classes periods ago, Europe was being overrun by the Germans, and the Roman Empire was fast declining. You had the kingdom of the Visigoths taking over Spain. They took over much of Spain. And then moving into Italy was the Ostrogoths. Now, when the Ostrogoths moved into Italy, they merged with the Romans, to where after a while there were no Romans, there were no Ostrogoths, there were people we call Italians. They spoke their own language, but mixed it with a little bit of Latin, to where after a time, the Latin language died. Now, the church made every attempt to revive the Latin language, but it wouldn't revive. The church made rules that church services had to be held in Latin. That didn't help. That the priests had to say Mass in Latin, well, that didn't help. That the Bible could only be written in Latin. Again, nothing they could do revive the Latin language. Try as they might, it died as a spoken language and was replaced by Italian. Now, Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal, this part of Europe speaks languages that are called Latin languages, while Germany and Great Britain, including English, they speak languages that are called Germanic language. Yes, English is considered an offshoot from the German tongue. Much of the rest of Europe speak languages not related either to Latin or to German. Now, in the meantime, also, there was a kingdom of the Franks. The Franks started out in the area around Paris, according to the map in your book. The word Franks means free, and from that we get the word France. France prides itself as a people of the free, even though of all the democracies, they were like the last people to get democracy, but they do have something that resembles democracy today. Your book says that for a time, Italy had two types of communities, an Ostrogoth community and a Roman community. Roman communities and Ostrogoth communities, and the Roman communities lived under Roman law, the Ostrogoth communities lived under Ostrogoth law. Eventually, these two groups merged. Now, Britain. The Romans had conquered Britain, but late in Roman history, the Romans realized they couldn't hold on to Britain anymore, so they abandoned Britain. So the Britons, that is the original inhabitants of Britain, were called the Britons. They were left to fend for themselves. Well, into Britain came the German peoples called the Angles, from which we get the word England. Angles, Saxons, and Jews. We sometimes call the British people Anglo-Saxon. Again, from the Angles, we get the word England.
Is this three different definitions? Of one
What's that?
term? The Anglo-Saxon and Jews.
Yeah, the Anglos, three different tribes of Germanic peoples who moved into Britain and somewhat took over and drove the Britons to two places, Wales, where the descendants still are, and Brittany over here in this peninsula in France. The Britons were driven to Wales and Brittany, and their descendants still live there. Now, the Welsh's biggest contribution to civilization is the story of King Arthur. Legend tells us, all right, I want to pause and describe what tradition and legend is. This, I can promise some of this will be on the final exam, whether you get it or not. All right, you have, of course, history. This is what most historians agree actually happened. I mean, it's based on original sources and evidence. If we can prove it happened, we call it history. But there's all kinds of stories that come out of history that we don't know whether we believe or not. Of course, I'll start off with myth. Myth, these are stories that involve gods. And again, every society on the other side of the world, I mean what we call the old world, begins its histories with what we call myth. The myths gave way to legends. The legends were often demigods, people who were said to be half god and half man, but gods were often involved. But you also have things called tradition. Oops. A tradition is a story that was passed down through the generations, passed down without being written down, and finally, maybe 200 or 300 years later, somebody wrote it down. But because you can't check it out against original sources, you don't know whether you can believe it or not. These are traditions. In my family, there's a tradition, you know, that's the traditions that my great-great-grandfather moved from one place to another at a certain time, but the problem is you cannot verify the move because he moved sometime between censuses. So it's just a story that was handed down through the generations that he moved at a certain year. It's called tradition. Stories that you can't quite verify because nobody living at the time wrote it down.
What did you say about legends?
Legend, these are stories that involve heroes a lot of times.
Right, okay.
Yeah, persons like Hercules. The story of Hercules you might call a legend. Again, there were Greeks living, particularly was in near Sparta. Near Sparta, who claimed that they were descended from Hercules. Take that for what you will. Now, I'm about to tell you a story that we could call tradition because nobody at the time wrote it down. It was passed down and finally written. Some of you might have heard it before. But folk, in the days before we had television, in the days before we had the internet, in the days before novels, people would stop their work in the fields and then gather around the campfire in the cool part of the day, and they would tell stories. The story I'm about to tell is one of the stories that was told most, and one of the more popular stories that's come down to us are people traveling on journeys, soldiers going off into battle. They would tell these kind of stories. Or trained minstrels, sometimes called bards. They would tell these kind of stories. Story goes now that there was a sorcerer named Merlin, and Merlin's father was a fallen angel who cohabited with an earth woman. Now again, folk, this as far as I know is the last time this kind of story was told, but nevertheless it was told. And the devil thought, I've got my Antichrist here. This baby that's born from this union will be the Antichrist. Instead, Merlin's mother attended Mass every day and attended church every Sunday. And when Merlin was born, he was taught by the priest, and he became, instead of becoming the devil's servant, he became a Christian. So he became something of a good sorcerer. He grew up and became prominent in Uther Pendragon's court, the king at that time. Now again, we don't know if Uther Pendragon existed or not. Some of these kings that lived around that time, like Vortigern and Vortimer, we know for sure they apparently did exist, but Vortimer did, Vortigern did. Uther Pendragon might not have. Anyway, when Uther Pendragon died, he'd had a son, but the son was only a baby. So Merlin gave this baby to Sir Ector and said, you raise the baby up, but don't tell anybody he's not yours. Just tell the people that he's your son. You at the time, when the right time comes, I'll send for him. So Sir Ector raised up a young baby named Arthur. And then Merlin told the people, now, the next king will be a king like none you've ever seen. He'll not regard rich, he'll regard only justice. You'll know who he is when he can pull this sword out of stone. And Merlin proceeded to wedge a sword in the stone. And for 15 years, nobody could pull it out. Well, 15 years went by. And a young boy was excited. There was a big party going on that day. And in those days, I mean, a big party meant a break from the humdrum of the routine. In the meantime, Arthur's older brother, Sir Kay, had just been knighted. And Sir Kay got all the way to the party and then started reaching under his tunic for his sword and, whoops, didn't have a sword. So Sir Kay, I mean, it was a disgrace for a knight to forget his sword. So Sir Kay said to his father, Dad, I don't have my sword. So Sir Ector said to Arthur, run home and fetch your brother's sword. And Arthur, I mean, why should I have to fetch it? Why shouldn't he? I mean, this is just unfair. Anyway, orders are orders. Arthur started running toward his home. Then Arthur realized in the churchyard nearby there was a sword wedged in a stone, and hadn't he heard that anything that was in the church really belonged to the whole community? If he borrowed it, who'd notice it missing? And besides, he'd return it once he was through with it. So he went to the churchyard, pulled the sword out of the stone. Then the only safe way to carry a spare sword is high in the air, so he raised the sword high in the air and ran pell-mell back to the party. I can remember once having that kind of energy, folks, but I can't tell you where it went. But anyway, and he broke into the clearing where the party was with a sword high into the air. The people at the party thought he had just come to announce he was king, even though nothing could be farther than the truth. Young Arthur did not notice that everybody who saw him started grabbing everybody's attention. Look at that. Then they all started following him. Young Arthur didn't notice anything was amiss until he got to where his family was. And his father said, son, where did you get this? I promise, I'll put it back. Nobody miss it. Now, wait a minute, son. Did you pull the sword out of the stone in the churchyard? At this point, Arthur looked around and noticed that everybody in the party had stopped everything they were doing. High and low alike were all gathering around. Whatever he had done, he had gotten the attention of everybody. The high-ups got their heads together and said, hey, maybe we ought to go back to the churchyard, wedge the sword back in the stone again. They did. They wedged the sword back in the stone. The strongest of the men tried to pull it out. None of them could. So they said, okay, Arthur. Gave him another turn. He pulled it out the same way before with one hand, according to some accounts. This experiment was repeated several times over until the people finally asked, we're seeing a work of real magic. England has found its long-lost king. You know, one of the older men in the group said, I knew Uther Pendragon when Uther was this boy's age. I always thought this boy resembled Uther. Finally, Sir Ector called Arthur aside and said, now, I got something to tell you, Arthur. I'm not your father. Never was. But Dad, who is my father? Apparently, son, your father was Uther Pendragon. Well, the people of England began to prepare to move Arthur and his family into the palace called Camelot. and Arthur became the most famous king England ever had. Now, I know probably most of you have heard this story before, maybe in a slightly different format. You might wonder, how much of this story can I believe? I'll let you decide for yourself how much you can believe. Again, how much you believe depends on your worldview. Now, we don't know if Arthur ever existed or not. However, what we do know is that for 40 years, the German people stopped moving into England. There was a battle fought called the Battle of Mount Badon, and some people believe that Arthur was the victor and he stopped the German advance, and the Germans realized that there was a powerful king in England. Supposedly Arthur had got about 150 knights together called the Knights of the Round Table. You can believe what you want to. We have never found King Lot, even though a few people now think they know where it was located. A few people think they've found evidence. There was a battle of Mount Badon. We found that battle, and there at the battle was a whole lot of helmets and swords and spears and arrows and whatever, indicating that once there was a battle fought in that area. But we have not found the proof we need about Arthur's existence. All right, this kind of story, folk, again, is, among other things, is called a tradition. In our own history, we had a King Lot. When John Kennedy was president, the White House was King Lot. And of course, there was a king and his wife. Anyway, that's another story entirely. I'll leave that. Anyway. Eventually, though, after Arthur died, or after Arthur, if he lived at all, would have lived around 500 CE. About after that time, England was overrun, and England set itself up into several kingdoms, and this was to last for 300 years until finally a king named Egbert united all these kingdoms into one. And Queen Elizabeth II, the present Queen of England, traces her ancestry back to Egbert. And Egbert traced his back to a king named Cerdic, who would have lived a little bit about the time Arthur did. And Cerdic, if you believe the legend, could trace his ancestry all the way back to Adam. Again, I have a book where it shows the lines of descent. And how much of it Queen Elizabeth believes, I don't know, but supposedly, if you can believe it, she can trace her ancestry all the way back to Adam. That's another story in itself. Now, again, it depends on how much of this you believe.